Another day, another story. The Russian economy has been facing significant challenges in recent years, resulting in an economic crisis. In this video, I will discuss Russia's economy, causes of economic crisis, and impacts. The main causes are declining oil prices. Russia heavily relies on oil exports as a major source of revenue. The sharp decline in global oil prices has severely affected the country's economy, leading to reduced income and fiscal constraints. Western sanctions following Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. The Western countries imposed economic sanctions on Russia. These sanctions have limited access to international financial markets and technology transfers, further deteriorating the economic situation and the structural issues. The Russian economy has long been plagued by structural issues, including a heavy reliance on natural resources, a lack of diversification, and inefficient state-owned enterprises. These factors have hindered economic growth and made the country vulnerable to external shocks. This impacts the economy of Russia in currency depreciation, capital flight and budget deficit. The Russian ruble has experienced significant depreciation against major currencies, leading to higher inflation and reduced purchasing power for the population. This has resulted in a decline in consumer spending and a negative impact on domestic businesses. The economic crisis has prompted capital flight, with both domestic and foreign investors withdrawing their funds from the Russian market. This has further exacerbated the economic downturn and limited investment opportunities within the country. The decline in oil prices and economic sanctions have led to a substantial budget deficit in Russia. The government has been forced to cut spending on social programs and infrastructure development, negatively affecting the overall quality of life for its citizens. Hello everyone, in this video I will discuss the topic Russia economic crisis. The Russia and Ukraine war started and now it's been a year. Russia economy is in decline, and there are shortages of certain goods. The IMF economic forecast for Russia from a prediction of decline to one of growth. In May of 2022, most analysts predicted that Russia's GDP would fall by around 7 to 8%. Some even believed that the sanctions would result in a 15% reduction in Russia's GDP. Inflation also seems to have it around 12%. While the Russian population's real income declined by about 2 to 3%. It's important to note that there was still a decline. Although the sanctions did not only have the short-term effects, but also the long-term effects will likely be devastating for the Russian economy if the sanctions are not lifted. International Monetary Fund, IMF, came out with recent prediction. They had predicted in October 2022 that the Russian economy would decline by around 3% in 2023. Because the war has cost the billions of dollars and the loss of hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens. The economic forecast, the IMF now believes that the global economy will grow by around 3%. The IMF did warn that the war in Ukraine is a major vulnerability in the global economy. And if things escalate, it could throw economies across the planet into turmoil. Let's now look at the different sectors of the Russian economy and see how they are working since the start of the war. I'll start with the key industries that have allowed Russia to survive its economy even with sanctions imposed. The arms manufacturing is one of the main components that kept the Russian economy from going into immediate recession. As the war ramped up, so did the production of weapons and ammunition. Normally, arms manufacturing only makes up around 1 to 2% of the industrial output in Russia. However, since the invasion began, this sector has increased to around 5% of total production. As Ukrainian forces continue to destroy and capture Russian equipment, arms manufacturers need to make sure Russia doesn't run out of weapons, tanks, missiles, and artillery shells. The Russian economy has shifted from one that operates in relative peace to a wartime economy, meaning that the manufacturing sector has large coming in from the government and private investors. Besides arms manufacturing, Russia's natural resources. Russia has a lot of natural gas and oil resources. A number of agreements reduce buying resources from Russia. Most of the countries in the world have been picking up their slack over the last year. Fossil fuels make up around 45% of the overall revenue for Russia, and around 60% of its export revenues are from oil to countries the European countries decided to stop importing oil from Russia. Obviously, they couldn't just completely cut off the purchase of oil. This would cause prices to skyrocket and could devastate European households. However, over time, Europe decreased its dependence on Russian oil. Natural gas has also played a very important role in Russian economy. Russia cut off gas supplies to Western countries. This caused overall sales to fall by around 45%. Russia, as it hurt one of their main revenue streams and didn't really have much effect on Europe. Number of other sectors are suffering greatly after the first year of the war. When we look at the overall health of the Russian economy, however, things don't look great. Average Russian citizens are the ones being hurt the most by the war and resulting sanctions. This has led to some pretty important economic sectors suffering greatly as well. Many private companies are reducing their investments in the country. They are also firing workers to help cope with inflation and the slowing of Russia's economy. Entire cities are dialing back spending and investments at the expense of infrastructure improvements. For example, the city of St. Petersburg has reduced its spending on a new subway system by 25 billion rubles, which was supposed to help people commute to work and get around the city. Foreign companies are also pulling investments from Russia. One of the industries that has been hit especially hard in Russia is car manufacturers. Leaders in the industry have shut down entire factories and let go of their Russian employees. Russian car companies can no longer get the parts they need from Western suppliers. And the parts that are secured tend to be scooped up by military contractors to build more war vehicles. Therefore, auto sales have decreased by around 60% since the invasion. The increasing prices clearly explain the internal aspects of the Russian economy. It is struggling to stay afloat as the war reaches its 1 year. Real estate in the country has fallen off a cliff. In Moscow, prices have been slashed by up to 30% just to move inventory. The resistance or inability of the Russian people to spend money on new properties will greatly hurt the economy in the future. Russia has spent the past several years investing in large-scale construction projects to create new housing and office spaces around the country. Without any buyers, these structures will remain empty, which could lead to the collapse of the real estate market. And if this wasn't enough to rock economic sectors across the nation, the Russian central bank implemented harsh measures to ensure that inflation was kept under control. As the war really got going and it was clear that Russia wouldn't win, the Russian central bank sharply increased interest rates to keep the ruble from falling in price. This had the desired effect, as there was more than 35% reduction in loans given by banks, which is one way to slow inflation. However, the central bank did something that is similar to what US banks did in the housing market crash back in 2008. Throughout the war, the Russian central bank increased the number of mortgage loans they gave out to people who could only afford to place a small down payment of 10 to 20% on a property. Therefore, in 2022, while during the war Russian citizens were receiving mortgage loans at incredibly high interest rates, and the fact that they could only place a small down payment on a property should have indicated that these people probably didn't have the necessary income to ensure they could make all of their payments on time, especially in a time of war and economic uncertainty. So now the Russian central bank may have a number of outstanding loan payments to collect from people who can't afford. This could eventually lead to a huge number of people completely defaulting on their loans and the collapse of the housing market. So the first year of the war, this is exactly what happened. Around 13% of borrowers began defaulting on their high-interest loans. Non-payment on car loans increased by 19% in September of 2022 alone. And unpaid mortgage loans raised by 35%. As the Ukraine war reached the end of the first year, the Russian economy is paying for the bad loans given out by banks. Overall, banks have been giving out fewer loans since the war started to help increase inflation. However, the loans they have been giving out are high risk. And the fact that with each month the war continues, more and more people will be defaulting on their payments is a very bad sign for the Russian economy. And every sector has been hit hard by the war. Sectors of the Russian financial market play an important role in the overall health of the economy. It's estimated that restaurants in Russia have had their revenues cut in half since the war began. People no longer have the money to spend on the things they once enjoyed as jobs are lost. And prices of goods continue to climb. However, there is a bigger problem, especially for industries that require a large number of workers to operate as more and more. On top of losing employees to the war effort, more than 7 lakh people have fled Russia to try and escape being conscripted or to get away from the oppressive rule of Russia. This means a lot that workers are one of the key components of a healthy economy are in extremely short supply. Experienced staff is becoming harder and harder to find. The people who make up this demographic are the same people being sent to fight in the war. Russian teachers are reported to have fled to places like Kazakhstan, Armenia, and Georgia, where they are now teaching classes in those countries. Russian restaurateurs are opening new locations outside of their native country where there are more opportunities. If the war lasts much longer, there will be no one left to work jobs outside of wartime production in Russia. And for obvious reasons, a single industry nation that relies on war to fuel its economy is a very dangerous thing. The Russian government claims it will never conscript more than 30% of a business's employees. However, this seems to be an empty promise. Russian government is scared they need more men to throw at Ukrainian forces. One of the most important sectors for Russia is information technology. In a world where computer programmers, hackers, and tech gurus rule, Russia cannot afford to lose key talent in this sector. However, it's now finding itself in an IT crisis that could have drastic consequences for its economy. Since the war began, it's estimated that around 30% of Russia's IT labor force has left the country. Businesses around the world are looking for IT workers, and the nations along Russia's borders are happy to scoop up skilled workers. However, as we have seen that sheer numbers can be deceiving. The same is true of the Russian economy. Over the last year, the Russian economy has looked good on paper. There have been profits in key sectors. And successful measures are taken to slow the economic decline of the nation, while keeping inflation under control. But the Russian economy is not healthy. The first year of the war is going to have long-lasting consequences. And Russia's economy is teetering on the edge of a recession. As the first year of the war ends, Russia is finding that profits from almost every other sector besides oil and gas have declined. The Russian government can only raise taxes so high, and cut spending on non-war related projects so low, and incur so much debt before the economy implodes on itself. This brings us to what might be the final nail in the economic coffin for Russia. More than 143 million ordinary people living in the country are definitely feeling the war's impacts on the economy. And since the people are the backbone of the economy, this is why when the IMF revised its economic forecast for Russia, it included an addendum that basically said, if everything stays the same, the Russian GDP might increase slightly. If everything goes to hell in a handbasket because of the war, the Russian economy will freefall into oblivion. This is paraphrasing, of course, but you get the idea. While the Russian central bank seems to have curbed inflation over the last year, this is not the full picture, due to higher taxes, a decrease in product demand, and the unpredictability of the future. The income of Russian citizens has not kept up with rising prices. One major contributing factor that kept Russia's economy semi-solvent during the first year of the war was the high prices of oil and gas in the world. Russia has resources that everyone wanted, and the war, along with several other global economic factors, drove oil prices way up. Russia was able to profit off of this scramble to purchase oil and gas. But as the second year of the war begins, this no longer seems to be the case. The economies of the United States and Europe are slowing down. Some argue that recessions have already started, meaning spending is being cut across the board. Oil and gas prices have been in a steady decline, which suggests that Russia will not be able to make the same huge profits on fossil fuels as it did last year. This is also true because of the sanctions and price ceilings Western nations have enacted on Russian goods. What all of this means is that oil and gas companies in Russia will bring in less revenue in the coming year. And when this happens, the Russian government will receive less in taxes. And Russia will have less cash to fund war. This is all on top of the fact that people in Russia can't pay back their loans. There is a mass exodus of workers trying to escape conscription. And inflation is starting to hit the general population hard. When we look at all of the economic data collected over the past year, as Russia continues to wage war in Ukraine, a very grim picture of Russia's economic future is painted. All indications suggest that Ukraine will continue to be successful at pushing Russian forces out of their country. It's also clear that Putin will not admit defeat, which suggests he will conscript even more men to fight in his war. Uncertainty about the future is what might be keeping the Russian economy afloat at the moment. As soon as something goes wrong for Russian forces in Ukraine or the war is completely lost, it's highly likely the Russian economy will collapse as the nation reorganizes itself into a post-war structure. No one guesses what this will actually look like, but a recession is almost inevitable for the Russian economy. As the second year of the war in Ukraine is about to begin, Russia will continue to pour money into his military. Eventually, all of this wartime spending will catch up with the Russian government. And with the current weak foundations in several sectors, the entire Russian economy could come crumbling to the ground. The experts reveal why Russia is in trouble. They says because of financial penalties imposed on Russia. And they've started disrupting the country's economy. The Moscow Stock Exchange has been shut for 2 days now. Investors are divesting themselves of Russian interest. The government's borrowing. The borrowing costs of the Russian government doubled to 17%. The credit agency has downgraded Russia to junk status. And to make this economic blowback worse, a number of multinationals are severing ties with Moscow. This includes energy companies, tech giants, banks, production houses, sporting bodies. A host of them have decided to suspend operations in Russia. If this trend continues, Russia could soon enter a recession. NATO additional strong sanctions and new limitations on what can be exported to Russia and Russia's leadership will face unprecedented isolation, they said. Now progressing at the second phase of the financial sections, we will weaken Russia's economic. With new financial measures, we're taking new powers to target Russian finance. As attacks continue in Ukraine and Russian troops and Russian forces press their advance, the West has unveiled a series of sanctions to deprive Putin of the funds he needs. For this war, they've targeted Russian banks, oligarchs, businesses, oil refineries and military exports. These financial penalties have already disrupted the Moscow Stock Exchange and sent the Russian currency cratering more than 30%. A sharper economic fallout is expected. In the days ahead, Russia could even enter a recession to make its economic blow back worse. The corporate world is also severing ties with Russia. A host of multinational companies have taken some big steps. If we speak of oil companies, energy giant Shell has decided to exit all Russian operations, including its partnership with Russia's state-owned Gazprom. Norwegian energy firm Equinor is also divesting its joint ventures in Russia. It will be abandoning a deal it struck almost 30 years ago. If we speak of tech giants, Dell has suspended all product sales in Russia. Intel is suspending chip shipments too. Russia's Facebook parent company Meta has borrowed Russian ads on its website. Twitter too has restricted access to Russian handles in Europe. And Google has banned the Russian state media from collecting ad money from its websites, apps and YouTube videos. Then we have financial institutions. British bank HSBC is winding down relations with several Russian banks. The New York Stock Exchange has temporarily suspended trading for Russian companies. Nasdaq too has barred Russian-owned firms from trading on its exchanges. The list doesn't end there. FIFA and UEFA have boarded Russia from all international competitions. The IOC has banned both Russian and Belarusian athletes from competing. Formula One has cancelled this year's Russian Grand Prix transport giants. FedEx and UPS have suspended their shipments to Russia. America's Delta Airlines have halted its alliance with Russia's Aeroflot. Disney has paused theatrical releases of its films in Russia. Netflix has suspended its streaming of all its services. And the singing competition Eurovision will not allow any Russian acts this year. Even the president of Russia hasn't been spared. In 2013 he was confirmed with an honorary black belt by World Taekwondo. The organization has now stripped him of this honor. It has also refused to recognize any Taekwondo events in Russia henceforth. Now here's the thing, some of these measures may be purely symbolic. They may not inflict serious economic damages on Russia, but they send a message to Moscow that there can be no place for such naked aggression in today's world. Now let's conclude. The economic crisis in Russia is a complex issue with multiple causes and far-reaching impacts. In order to overcome this crisis, Russia needs to diversify its economy, implement structural reforms, and exercise fiscal discipline. It is crucial for the government to address these challenges comprehensively in order to restore economic stability and improve the living standards of its citizens. Thank you for watching, and if you find my video informative, please like and subscribe to my channel.